Hi, welcome to my how to solder video. This is going to mostly be for beginners, but these skills definitely are valuable for people that have soldered before and that are trying to get better at soldering. So, a couple skills that you are going to learn today are going to be how to tin wires, different gauge wires, ranging from 22 gauge to about 14 gauge. And you're also going to learn how to tin pads, as well as how to solder on pin headers. So the first thing you want to start with is you want to get some solid solder. I would recommend some 60-40 solder. This is rosin core. It's very important. And then I would set your, well, first of all, if you are looking for a new soldering iron, I would get something with some sort of temperature gauge on it. And you want to set that to 370 C for some of the less thick wire, all the way up to about 400, maybe even 420 C if you're soldering something that is much thicker, that requires more heat. And that is about, at 420 C, that is about 390 Fahrenheit, and 370 C is about 700 Fahrenheit. Now we're going to start with 370 C, because we are just going to be tinning these pads. Now the first thing you want to do is you want to take your soldering iron and you just want to clean it off. Take a little bit of solder and then just add it to the soldering iron so it's nice and shiny all the way around. And then you want to get a nice cleaner right here and just clean it off. Another good way to clean it off is you add a little bit of water to some foam pads. You don't want to do them dry, you don't want to do that, but you can add a little bit of water, some foam pads, and clean off your soldering iron like that. Now, let's see. Now, right here, we are going to use our solder at 370 degrees Celsius. And we're going to just tin these pads right here. So what you want to try to do first is put the soldering iron on the pad, then feed the solder into the soldering iron. Wait for a couple seconds to make a nice shiny joint. And this is called tinning pads. Now you don't want to hold it on for too long, because what'll happen is you'll burn off all the resin. See, if I hold it down for too long, what's going to happen is it's not going to be nice and shiny anymore. And solder, as you can see right there, will actually follow the soldering iron. The resin helps to keep the solder nice and shiny and round. So we'll fix that with a little bit more solder. Look at that, nice and shiny. Now the next step is going to be desoldering some of these cables right here. So for desoldering, you want to add a little bit of solder to your soldering iron. Then another helpful tool to have, it's not needed, but you can have some of these tweezers. And then grab on to the wire, heat up the pad a little bit, and just pull that right off like that. And pull that right off. And I'm also cleaning off my soldering tip every single time I work on a new joint. so it stays nice and clean. Ideally, every time you clean it off, you want to be adding more solder to the tip. Keep it nice and shiny. Next, we're going to learn how to strip wires. This is a very helpful skill to know how to do. I personally like to do it with tweezers, but if you have nice, soft silicone wire like this, then you can even do it with your nails. So I'll take this wire right here, and I can just strip off some of the insulation with my nail. And that is then before we add it to the PCB, to the board, printed circuit board. That's what PCB stands for. Before we add it back on to the circuit board, we are going to be tinning these wires. First, let me just show you how to do some more stripping with some wire cutters. Wire cutters are very helpful. If you get some nice good ones with a flat edge, those are usually the best. So you can take the end of this wire, put a nice amount of pressure on it so you're just gripping all the way through the insulation, but not cutting through the wire. So you're gripping onto that and then pulling that off. Nice, good strip. Next, what we're gonna do is we're gonna try to tin, you know what, I'm gonna finish off the last one. Look at that, just a couple millimeters off is all you need. So next, so there are a couple ways to do this. It's usually nice to have something else to hold it on. So your left hand is free to feed in the solder. So now you want to hold your soldering iron right below the wire. So this is 24 gauge wire. So we're going to be feeding in the solder. So first of all, let's just heat up this soldering iron. Just tin the iron right there. And we're going to be adding in some solder while the soldering iron is touching the wire. See, I'm only touching the wire for a short amount of time, or else we're going to be losing all of the resin that's inside the solder, because the longer the wire, here, I'll show you exactly what I'm talking about. So if I were to hold the soldering iron onto the wire for longer, so I would hold it onto there, all that resin is melting off, so it's not going to be a nice, clean, round, and shiny joint anymore. So then the solder is going to actually follow the soldering iron. This one's not too bad. It's got a lot of resin in it, but it's doing a little bit. I don't know if you can see it there. It's good practice though, to not hold your soldering iron too long on a joint, just long enough. Just takes practice. Nice and round and shiny. Do the last one right here. And look at that. And we can clean that up. Perfect. And that is how you tin 24 gauge wire. So I tinned that with 370 degrees Celsius soldering iron. So now I'm going to switch over my soldering iron's temperature to 420 degrees Celsius, which is about 800 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, we are going to be using that for this wire. This is going to be 14 gauge wire, which is going to be used mostly for power cables. So now, it's a lot harder to strip this wire with just my fingernails. So I'm gonna have to use some wire cutters. So as you see, let's fix this. As you see right here, I'm gonna be taking this wire and putting a decent amount of pressure. So there are a couple different ways to do this. I personally like to cut into the insulation just a little bit. Now it does take practice. It gets a little tough, but with some practice you can figure out the right amount of pressure, and I like to go all the way around about 180 degrees, cutting nice and deep into that insulation. Then once you've cut all the way into that insulation, you can just pull it up while adding pressure. You get a nice, good strip. Now the other thing I forgot to mention, the other wires, the other 24 gauge wires that I just stripped were nice and bundled together. But these bigger gauge wires, this 14 gauge wire, can easily be separated. Sometimes you separate it all like that, and you don't want to tin that. So what you want to do is you want to push all the wire together, and what I like to do is I like to take 2 fingers and twist it all together so it's nice and together and ready to be tinned. Now let's strip the other 16 gauge wire. Just like that. We're going to take that wire and twist it up like that. It's nice and ready to be tinned. Now, like I mentioned before, I increased the temperature of my soldering iron to 420 degrees Celsius, or about 800 degrees Fahrenheit. These thicker cables love to suck up that heat, so it's very helpful to have a hotter soldering iron. So now, just like I did before, you want to tin that soldering iron, and you want to put the soldering iron underneath the wire and slowly feed in that solder. But this time, it's a much thicker wire, so you're going to have to hold on that soldering iron onto the wire for a little bit longer until it's gone all the way through the entire wire. Now it's very important to tin your wires, or else bad things can happen. If you don't tin your wires and you leave your wires like this and you try to solder that directly to a joint without the entire wire. So the other thing is that when you tin a wire, what you're doing is you're filling the entire inside of the wire with solder. Now, if you were to just take this wire and you were to solder that to any sort of joint, what would happen would be that the outside of the wire would be the only thing sticking to that joint. So if you had a crash or some sort of pressure exerted, then the only force holding that wire together to the joint would be just the outside wire. So it's very important to tin your wires and fill them all the way fully with solder. So now we're going to tin this other 16 gauge wire. Heat up bottom iron and slowly add more and more solder until the entire wire fills up with solder. As you can tell, I can actually just add on the solder onto the top of the wire because the hotter temperature allows the entire wire to heat up much faster. So I don't even need to touch the solder to the wire. Here, I'll demonstrate that again. So I'm heating up the wire from the bottom, and that, because it's a higher temperature at 420 degrees Celsius, it's able to heat up the entire wire much more easily, so I don't even need to put the solder directly onto the iron. I can just add it to the top of the wire because it's the same temperature as a soldering iron. And look at that. Some nice tinned. Here, let me fix that black cable. I spent a little bit too much time on it. So also, if you see this start to happen, that means you started to lose some of that resin. So it's not round and shiny anymore. So we can fix that very easily by adding some more solder. And look at that. I didn't hold my soldering iron on the wire for too long. Just long enough for it to fully engulf the wire. So now that is a nice, shiny, and round joint. So that's a big requirement for soldering. Directly after you strip your wires, you have to make sure to tin them fully before you solder them to a new joint. So now we're going to solder on these 24 gauge wires back onto this printed circuit board. Now you want to set your soldering iron to 370 degrees Celsius. And another good thing to do, which I forgot last time, is to use some sort of weight so that you don't have to worry about your printed circuit board slipping on you. Now let's tin one more pad here. Actually, yeah, I've tinned this pad right here. So first of all, yeah, you want to tin the soldering iron. Look at that. Add some weight to the printed circuit board. Now these wires are tinned all the way through. So they have solder going all the way through to the center of the wire. So then, take one of the wires close to the tip, and we're going to set it directly on top of the pad we want to solder it onto. We're going to add some heat from the top, add a few seconds of heat, and you can still have that nice round shiny joint. Do the next one. Remember, you don't want to put too much heat on it, or else you're going to remove all of the resin from the solder. And just a couple seconds of heat, and it sticks on there with a nice round circle, nice and shiny. And that is how you solder on nice thin 24 gauge wire.